All right, appreciate you guys being with us tonight. Appreciate you guys being online and you all being in here. Thank you, Aaron. We are in 1 Timothy chapter 5, and we're going to continue looking at the pastorals. This one is specifically 1 Timothy, and if you remember, 1 Timothy is more about the function of the church and the leadership of the church, and he's talking about how it's organized. We got qualifications of elders, qualifications of deacons, pastors. Then he went into chapter 4 with apostasy, that you guys are being taught different things, and you're believing it, and you're going out and you're basing your teaching on speculation and conjecture and fables, old wives' tales, that kind of thing. And his advice to Timothy was, yes, stay true to the word. You have to stick to what it says. Don't embellish it. Don't add to it. God's word doesn't need any help. It's stood on its own for centuries and it doesn't need our help. So stand on it. Now, you get to chapter 5. Chapter 5, he switches gears a little bit. We're going to talk about interpersonal relationships. And he's going to talk about two different, he's going to talk about one in particular, widows, but there's categories of them. And then he's going to talk about everybody in the church, old ladies, old men, young ladies, young men. And remember, we kind of define old as over 40. If you're over 40, you're in the older men category. If you're under 40, you're in the younger men category. So I know that stings. I know it hurts, but that's the gist of it. So now he's going to help us in verse 1. Look at verse 1. Or actually, let me say this. This is what we call a transitional section. Verses 1 and 2 of chapter 5 is transitional. In other words, it's connecting two different ideas. And so we looked at in chapter 4, verses 11 through 13. He's talking about apostasy. And matter of fact, in those verses, he says, prescribe and teach these things, believe these things, hold dear these things. And then in chapter 3, or chapter 5, verses 3 through the end of the chapter, it is specific content. So he said, I want you to teach these certain things, stay true to God's word, teach these certain things. And then he's going to say, okay, here's the way you deal with people interpersonally. Here's some relationships in the church. And so these two verses form the bridge between those two thoughts. So we're going to start chapter 5, which is not actually getting into the content till verse 3, because these first two is just building the bridge from what we've already talked about up into what we're going to talk about tonight. So look at chapter 5. And before I start reading this, let me make this point. Have you ever thought about, and I read this one time and I thought it was the best explanation ever. If you think about clothing, shirts, pants, whatever, they have seams. And the seams separate. They form natural divisions. You have a seam that starts the sleeve. You have a seam, for the body, the pants, and have seams and all that stuff. And the seams naturally divide up the garment. All right, it's still a whole. It's still one shirt. There's still one pair of pants, but their seams just kind of divided up into sections almost. It's almost like the church over the years has created its own seams. It's self-divided. If you think about a church, think about the makeup of a church. Age differences. We have age differences. That's why we have age-graded Sunday school. This age go with this age go with this age, and they tend to hang out that way. We have gender differences. We have women do certain things, men do certain things. It's all, we've created these kind of natural barriers. And they, for the most part, work together well. For the most part, they work pretty effortlessly. Sometimes they cause division. If those seams fail, if the seams are causing more division than they are uniting, then it's up to the leadership of the church to work through those difficulties, work through those issues. That's kind of what Paul's talking to Timothy about. He's going to say, in the church, you're going to have people that are apostates. There's going to be people that are in the church with you, they've heard the truth, they know all these things, but these false teachers have come in, these ascetics, and they've taught you that marriage is not good, because it creates physical intimacy, which is bad, because that's part of the physical world, which is sin. They're going to teach you that you can't eat certain things. That's not true. God created all things good as long as you're thankful for it. But there's people that's going to come into the church and they're going to teach these things, and you're going to have some people to believe it. And he says you need to address that. You need to teach the truth, make sure the people remember the truth. And now we're going to get to this idea where what about those different groups, those seams in the church? How do we respond to each one of those? How do we deal with those? And so he's going to lay it out in chapter 5. Look at verse 1. Do not sharply rebuke an older man over 40, but rather appeal to him as a father, to the younger men as brothers, the older women as mothers, and the younger women as sisters in all purity. There's our bridge. That's the transition. In other words, look at the wording and see if you pick up on this. Don't sharply rebuke an older man, because Timothy is under 40, so he's a younger fellow. But rather appeal to him as a what? A father. Appeal to the younger men as what? Brothers. Appeal to the older women as what? Mothers. And the younger women as what? Sisters. What's that? A family. He says, as a leader in the church, you relate to people as a family. Treat them like you would your family. That's his instruction. That's the bridge. You have certain people in the church that are apostates. Address it, deal with it. But then you're going to have people in the church that are not apostates. You have older men, older women, younger men, younger women. Treat them like family. Treat the older ones like father, like brothers, like sisters, mother. Treat them like that. In other words, they are all a household, and you treat them like that. All right, that's how he bridges this. Look at what he says about older men. Treat them respectfully and appeal to them gently rather than sharp rebuke. You got to appeal to them gently. In other words, their chronological. Here's where these things were. Their chronological age, not just their spiritual age, makes them worthy of respect. Respect your elders. We're one of the, me and Nancy was talking about this the other day, we're one of the only countries in the world that really does not. All these other countries put their elders on a pedestal and treat them well and take care of them. We don't. And so Paul is giving Timothy some advice on what do you do when these older people are in the church. How do you take care of them? And he said for these older men, treat them with respect. Even if they're not spiritually mature and they're buying into this stuff, they're listening to false teachers, don't just openly, publicly criticize them, but treat them like you would your dad. Pull them in and tell them you have concern and you're praying for them. You want to help them figure out the right thing to believe and do. And it goes a long way. And it's not just church officials that's these older men. It's everybody, all the men in the church. So look at the 4 categories. First is older men. So here's the implication. There are times when Timothy, as a young pastor, is going to have to correct some of the older fellows. He's going to have to kind of to rebuke them, and sometimes in 1 Timothy even exclude them from fellowship. If they won't come back. And so he says there's going to be times you have to do that. You've got to correct them. And what he's already told Timothy was, you remember he said, don't let them despise your youth. And really what he was saying is, you don't be intimidated by your youth. Don't be intimidated that you're younger than they are. Because you're the leader of the church at Ephesus, there are times when your age is going to require you, your position, even though your age, is going to require you to chastise or rebuke some of the older people in the church, but don't let it intimidate you from doing what's right, but do it gently. I've always said this, there's a right way and a wrong way to do the right thing. You can do the right thing. 2 people can approach a problem, the same problem, with the same goal, the same outcome. They can both be right, but one can address the problem in the right way, a tactful way, a good way, and one's going to approach it like a bull in a china shop. It's going to make matters worse. And so he says, when you deal with older people in the church, and we're talking about chronologically older, deal with them respectfully, just like you would treat your father, patiently and reverently almost. Then he says younger men. He says, church leader has to deal with younger men, under 40. And he says, for the younger ones, don't treat them like they're inferiors. Just because they're younger than you chronologically does not mean that you're better than they are. They're not inferior to you. They're on the same level as you. So treat them with respect. Treat them like they have something to contribute. Treat them like that they're valuable members of the church at Ephesus, in other words. Then he goes on to the older women. He says, older women, he says, treat them and think about them like you would your own mom. You know, in other words, and really I always say, Mother's Day and is a great day. You know, for some reason everybody on Mother's Day wants to take their moms out to lunch. You know, they buy them a gift, they give them a card. For Father's Day, they want us to take them out to lunch. You know, and all this. But anyway, that's for another day. But he says these older ladies in the church, because of their experience, because of their age, treat them like a mom. Give them special consideration. You know, treat them kindly, because he says, and I get this because I experience it too, and I try to do the best I can with it. But he says, Timothy, you're a younger fellow, even though I'm not in this younger age thing. But he says you're probably going to be a little, not intimidated, but you're going to have a problem relating to some of the older ladies. It's easier to relate to the older men. It's easier to relate to the younger men. It's hard for a man pastor to relate to some of the older women. He said, so just treat them like you would your mom. You know, take care of them like that. And then the younger women, he said, the younger women, he calls them sisters. He says, treat them with purity. Same way you treat your physical sister, your biological sister. Because in all honesty, here's the temptation that was plaguing the church here, and even plagues some churches today. There's some pastors that blur the lines in that regard, and they look at the younger ladies, females in the church, with impurity, not purity. And he says you can't blur that line. You have to treat them like you would your sister. Just look at them like that. And so that's how he bridges this gap, all right? So all through this epistle, Paul is going to urge Timothy to adopt certain attitudes and certain principles for certain people. You know, you deal with people this way, all right? And so he says that as a result, if you do that, then the church is going to function well. Now, get to verse 3. Verse 3, he starts the categories. And so he says, the first thing is, I want to give you some instruction concerning the church's responsibility for widows. All right? And there's certain responsibilities that we have, but there's also certain responsibilities that the widows have to qualify as a widow. Widows have been and still are a particularly vulnerable group of people. Especially when they have nobody around them. And so the early church is going to mirror Christ's attitude and Paul's attitude in taking care of these people who are vulnerable. This section on widows is the longest section in the New Testament dealing with a certain group of people. He talks more about how to deal with widows than he does pastors. He talks more about widows than he does how to deal with deacons. It's because it's important. And so he's going to tell us that this is important. And when we go through this, I want you to pay attention to this. He deals more with younger widows than older widows. He mentions the older ones, but very briefly. Then he goes to the younger ones. The reason being is it seems like, and it's not scripturally clear, but there's kind of a preponderance of evidence to support it, that most of those widows that he's already told Timothy, you're going to have these widows in your church that are going to be influenced by false teachers. It appears that most of that's from the younger widows. It's the younger ones who are not quite yet established in their faith solidly that are going to fall for the false teaching. It's the older women that have been in the faith for a while that are more secure. That's why he's going to say to the older women, you guys mentor the younger ones. Because they're not secure yet. And they're easily manipulated because they have no, and God knows my heart when I say this is not to be funny or not to be critical, But basically he's saying they have no male leadership to help them. They have nobody to guide them. They have nobody at home to help teach them. Nobody's reading scripture with them. Nobody's praying with them. They're by themselves. And so anybody comes along and teaches them some kind of false thing, it sounds good, they have a tendency to believe it. And so he says, I want you to make sure you take care of the widows, especially the young ones. All right, look at verse 3. Verse 3 and 4. Honor widows who are widows indeed. All right, watch the wording. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, they must first learn to practice piety in regard to their own family and to make some return to their parents, for this is acceptable in the sight of God. The basic thought when you say widow is loneliness. They're by themselves. And so he says, if they're widows indeed. All right, now, I don't know if you saw this in here, but he's going to give us 3 categories of widows. There's three different types. Look at the first. He says there are those who are bereaved. They've lost a husband, but look what he says. Verse 4. If any widow has children or grandchildren. So this is the first category of widows. If there is a widow and she has children or grandchildren, look whose responsibility is to take care of the mom, the children or grandchildren. It's their responsibility. It does not fall to the church first. It falls to the family first, to the kids first. There's 3 reasons for doing that. Look at his 3 reasons. They first learn to practice piety. In other words, if some kids or grandkids have a mom or a grandmom who is now a widow, it is a sign of piety or godliness. It's a sign of that in them if they take care of their mom or their grandmama. He said, so if there's a widow, it's a weird word, but he calls it a widow indeed. If there's a widow indeed, a true widow, but just a bereaved one, she's not completely by herself, she has family, it's up to them first. And the first reason they ought to do it is it's a sign of godliness. If you have a mom, she doesn't have a husband, take care of her. That's a sign that you're living godly. Number 2, he says, look at verse 4 again. To make some return to their parents. What does that mean? He sees it as kind of a payback for the earlier care that the child has received. He said, okay, if you have a mom, she's all of a sudden a widow, you take care of her. Number 1, it's a sign of godliness. Number 2, you're paying her back for raising you. All the work she put in your life, you're just giving it back to her. Then look at number 3. He says, it is acceptable in the sight of God. In other words, care for older widows is pleasing to the Lord. He said, it's okay, there's a first category of widows. These widows have family. They have children or grandchildren. And so Paul says to Timothy, in your church, look around your church. If there's a widow in your church, she has family, it's their responsibility first. And this is, remember what he says, prescribe these things? That's teach. Teach these things. Teach them to the people. Tell the children out there, it's your responsibility to go take care of your mom. You got to do it. And he says to Timothy, remind them. That's a sign that they're living a godly life, and you're just paying them back for what they did for you. And so he says that's the first category. Second category of widows, look at verse 5. Now if she who is a widow indeed and has been left alone. So the second one is they're not just bereaved, they are bereft. That's the clinical word we use. In other words, they have nobody. They have no children, no grandchildren. They're completely by themselves. So there's one category where they have family. The second one is they have none. And he says, if they have none, look at verse 5. If she's a widow indeed and who has been left alone, has fixed her hope on God and continues in entreaties and prayers night and day. So this second explanation is if you look around the church and there's a widow in the church who has nobody, then guess whose obligation it is to take care of them? The churches. It's the church. As a matter of fact, they get real serious about it. It doesn't seem like in the first century when Paul wrote this, it was as it was as prevalent as it was in about the 3rd century. And it's certainly not, we don't do it today. But he said, if they have nobody, the church has to take care of them. However, there's caveats to this. She has to do something. So look what it says in verse 5 and 6. Now she is a widow indeed, and who has been left alone, has fixed her hope on God, continues in entreaties and prayers night and day. So in other words, not every widow in that second category deserves help. Not every widow deserves the church to help them. Look what Paul says. Look at how he puts these on here. He says, only those widows without children or without supporting relatives. The Greek word is memonome. It means all by yourself. It means that you're left alone. And he says, look at the requirement. If she's really left alone and she has no family, but she's fixed her hope on God. In other words, if there's a widow in the church, she has nobody, but she is constantly, you can tell, she's relying on God to help her. She knows that God will meet her needs. And look what it says. She keeps praying. She's entreating and praying. And so he says, if there's a widow in the church like that, then you got to help her. You have to do it. It's the requirement. You know, if there's a widow in the church and nobody's there to help her, nobody's there to take care of her, and she is godly and she's living a life to where you can see that she's actively pursuing God to help her in her life, then the church has a responsibility to help. But watch verse 6. But she who gives herself to wanton pleasure is dead even while she lives. In other words, if they're really looking for God to help them, then you help them. But verse 6 says, those widows that are giving themselves to lustly pleasures, you're not required. You can. I mean, you can certainly say yes, and the church can certainly say, oh yeah, we'll help you, but there's no spiritual requirement for it. Because she's not relying on God, she's relying on other things. In other words, this was the biggie here, especially in Paul's day, not so much now, but in Paul's day, some of the widows, especially the younger ones, if they were widows and had no help, they turned to immoral things in order to make ends meet, most time prostitution. And so you find all through the ancient Near East, these ladies that have been widowed, then they turn to prostitution because they can't eat. So they turn to it. Paul says, listen, you're under no obligation to help them because they are not requiring, they're not seeking God's assistance. They're trying to help themselves by doing something that's immoral. And he says to Timothy, if Ephesus has a church, if they want to help her, fine, go for it. But I'm not really requiring you spiritually to do it because she's not really trusting in the Lord. That's what I've always said. One of my pet peeves is when people call the church and they'll say, can you help me with a bill? And I'll say, well, where do you go to church at? You know what they say? Well, I don't go to church. And I'm like, well, why do you want the church to help you? You know, you don't have any use for us until you want to check. You know, it don't make sense to me. And so my philosophy is always, if you're, I'll do anything for anybody if you're trying to help yourself. But if you're not trying to help yourself, then I don't feel responsible. I don't feel like just throwing good money after bad if you're not trying to do something for yourself. And that's kind of what he's saying. If these widows in the church, if they're really godly and they're seeking God's help and they're relying on God to help them, God's going to help them. And it'll be through you. The church will do it. However, if they're coming to church on Sunday and prostituting themselves during the week, you're not obligated to help them because they're not seeking God's will for their life. So you deal with it the way you want. And so look at what he says and see what scripture applies to this. Those who give themselves to wanton pleasure is dead, even while she lives. In other words, those women receive in their lives what Paul said in Romans, is the wages of sin. They're receiving that wage now. Paul said they're just good as dead, spiritually. It's no good for them. So he says that those are the categories of ladies, of widows. You look at verse 7. Prescribe these things. When he says prescribe, is the word for teach. So he says teach them these things. And he says in verse 7, prescribe these things as well so that they may be above reproach. So he says, I want you to teach these things so that, and here's the kicker for us. He said, I want you to teach the church these things. What things? What he just said about the widows that we have to take care of. He said, teach these things to the church so that the household of faith will understand what their responsibility is, so that they know. In other words, it's not the government's place. It is not the government's responsibility under the creation of God to take care of widows. That's not their function. It's not their role. It's the church's role. But you know what's happened? The church has abdicated that responsibility over the year, and the government has stepped in, and they have usurped the church because the church has just kind of abdicated authority in it. That's our place. It's not the government's place. But we're not doing it, so the government stepped in. And we ought to be ashamed of ourselves, to be honest with you. So he says, this is what you teach them. Look at verse 8 now. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied his faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Now, this is one of those things where Paul is quoting that's a commonly accepted teaching. And he's teaching it so that he can encourage the relatives of widows to do the right thing. And it's not scriptural. There's no other scriptural basis for this. It's just what Paul is saying based on the world. In other words, he says, it's what Paul's saying. Unbelievers believe this. He says, you can look around, all the unbelievers around Ephesus, they're taking care of their family. All these unbelievers out there, when their mom's a widow, they're doing it. And he said, but you guys are in the household of faith, and you're not. So he said, if you don't take care of your own family, you're worse than the lost people. Because even the lost people do this. And you're not doing this. So if you're not doing this, you're worse than the lost people that don't know Jesus. All right? That's what he means by verse 8. It is not an easy thing to do sometimes, but it's the right thing. Now, look at verse 8, or verse 9. A widow is to be put on the list only if she's not less than 60 years old, having been the wife of one man, having a reputation for good works, and if she has brought up children, if she has shown hospitality to strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has assisted those in distress, and if she has devoted herself to every good work. This is the part we don't do. The first century probably started it, but Paul's teaching kind of indicates that they weren't doing it. They started later, but the church kept the list. Look at the list of widows. And he said, I want you to keep this list of widows. In other words, it was a widows indeed list. True widows. But in this particular case, it was widows that needed regular help. In other words, weekly, monthly, whatever. It was the church's regular mission. We got these ladies on this list, and we're going to help them. Every week, we're going to help them. Every month, we're going to help them. Whatever you decide, we're going to do it. But Paul says, don't put them on the list unless they meet these criteria. Don't just put everybody on there, but put them on there. Look at this thing. If she's over 60, if she's under 60, don't put her on the list. If she's over 60, put her on the list. If she's been the wife of one man, that does not mean, I don't think, that her husband died, she remarried, or and then the second husband died or something. It kind of means the same thing as the deacon and the pastor, that she's faithful to one guy. You know, she's not in a bigamous relationship. In other words, she don't have two husbands at the same time. So he said, if she's over 60, if she's faithful to one guy, look at verse 10. If she has a good reputation for good works, and that is, those are actually the three qualifications: over 60, wife of one husband, and doing good works. And then he gives examples of the good works. Look at the examples he gives. She's brought up children responsibly. She's raised her children responsibly. It's not talking about just childbirth. It's talking about raising them in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. If she's done that, look at number 2. If she's been hospitable, that means she has offered hospitality to strangers. If she's done that. Number 3, if she's kind of humbly served her Christian brothers and sisters. And look what it says about this in verse 10. If she has washed the saints' feet. That don't mean, or that doesn't mean, if Chrissy's listening, she'll get me for that. It doesn't mean that for a widow to be put on this list, she has to go around and wash everybody in the church's feet. Washing the saints' feet is a euphemism for doing good works. Being in service to somebody. So whatever service you want to use, so she got to do that. Look at number 4. She helps people in distress or in special need. And number 5, she has devoted herself to good works. Look, he says every good work. So he says if she's done that, then you can put her on this list. And this list will say, here's a lady that is 70 years old. She has raised her kids well. She's faithful to her husband all these years. She helps out in the church. She's kind to everybody. She's hospitable and gracious. She's just an epitome of a godly lady. Her husband's gone. Her kids are not helping, for whatever reason, or they could be gone as well. Then he says, you can put that lady on the list to get regular support from the church. You can make sure she gets a regular, I won't say payment, but support. Just support her on a regular basis. All right, look at verse 11 then. But refuse to put younger widows on the list. All right, put the younger ones on there. For when they feel sensual desires in disregard of Christ, they want to get married. All right, he's really hung up on his marriage thing. Thus incurring condemnation because they have set aside their previous pledge. He says younger widows, if they're younger, they're going to have and again, he's very confusing when he says this because he also tells them to remarry. I mean, he gives them a command to do that. But here he says, don't put the younger widows on this list because their desires, they're still young. They may want to get married again, whereas an older lady may not. And this younger widow, she's going to want to get married again, so she can marry somebody who's going to take care of her. So don't put her on the list because her desire to go get married and date and court and all this thing, it's really almost like he's describing it almost like a monk nunnery type thing because he says she is not going to keep her pledge to Christ if she's out, trying to find a husband, So she's going to do that because she's still able to do it. But the older one's not, so you can take the other ones on there. Now, I want you to look at this word, or look at the phrase in verse 12 or verse 11, and I want to show you something about the Greek language. Do you see? It says they feel sensual desires in disregard of Christ. In Greek, it's one word. That's one word in Greek. When they translated it, broke it down into a phrase. It's katastreneosis, and it means to become wanton against or to turn from. And he says those ladies. So when we translate that from Greek, or the translators did, they're like, man, that's hard to translate. So they said, okay, here's what that means. Her desires are going to overcome her to get married again, and so her life's going to be on a different track. You don't really feel the need to help her out. You can, but you're not obligated to. In other words, Paul assumed that if you put somebody on this list, say the church is going to help them regularly, Paul assumed those people on that list were going to have a wholehearted commitment to Jesus. It's going to be their whole heart. And so that's his thing. Look at verse 13. At the same time, they also learn to be idle as they go around from house to house, and not merely idle, but also gossips and busybodies, talking about things not proper to mention. So he says, if you now this is stereotypical, and this is hard to say, but here's what he's saying. If you put a younger lady on the list and say, okay, you guys don't worry about it, we're going to support you as a church, then it said that they're not going to do anything but turn into gossips. They're just going to go around from house to house because of idle hands, there's nothing to do, and so they're just going to go around, they're going to just gossip all day long. So don't do that to the younger ones. The younger ones can go get married. You know, they can find a husband. And so, as a matter of fact, I like the word he uses. Look at the word in verse 13. But also gossips and busybody. They're just turning into busybodies. You know, don't turn them into busybodies. You know, so that's his instructions about the younger people in the church. Look at verse 14. Therefore, because of all I just said. Remember what's the therefore? Because of what he just said. I want younger widows to get married. I want them to go get married. I don't want them on the list. They can still go get married. I want them to get married, and then I want them to have children, keep the house, and give the enemy no occasion to reproach. By remarrying, Paul said, these younger widows are not going to give Satan an opportunity to criticize them for going back on their pledge to be committed to Christ. There's going to be no occasion for that. And so he says these young women are going to go out, they can get married, they can bear children. He doesn't mean that every one of them is going to do this. He just says it's preferable to put them on that list. It's really kind of what we look at today, you know. I mean, marriage is just, people look forward to that. Look at verse 16. If any woman who is a believer has dependent widows, she must assist them, and the church must not be burdened, so that it may assist those who are widows indeed. This is his conclusion. And he says, I want to correct a misunderstanding here. It's basically what he's saying. He says, if financially capable women should assist those that are not. And if they have relatives, the relatives should assist. Because if in other words, if you can help yourself, then it won't place an undue burden on the church to help, because you can help yourself. If you can't help yourself, the church will step in and do it. And that's Paul's teaching to Timothy. And really there's three things at the core of this. Look at Paul's things. Treat people with respect. Just be respectful. Number two, have compassion. Just look at people with compassion like Jesus did. And number three, accept your responsibility. Do what you're supposed to do. And I believe not only in the church but in life, if we went by those three things, it'd be a whole lot better world. Just respect people. Have a little compassion. You know, I was in I don't know if I doubt they're watching me, but I was in Ingles parking lot yesterday, and two ladies was in the car beside me, and they just kind of let their buggy go, and it just rolled down and bounced right off my car. And I got out and looked, and it didn't do any damage. But what struck me was they never said, I'm sorry. Not one of them said, I apologize. Oh, it got away from me. The wind got it, or I'm sorry. They just kind of started giggling and pulled their cart away. I'm like, where's the common courtesy? You know, and the flesh probably came out a little more than it should have. And then I admit that I had to apologize. But I said, my car's fine if y'all care. And they just kind of looked at me, and I said, most people would say I'm sorry, you know. And so they still giggling, so I just got back in the car, and then I thought, I don't know if I should have said that or not, but it just infuriates me when people don't have common courtesy. Just be compassionate, you know. That's all people are asking for. So that's his teaching on widows. Now we don't have time to do the rest of this chapter because he's next going to talk about elders. And he's going to talk about overseers, older men, elders, and pastors in a church. And he's going to talk about them receiving honor, double honor, that kind of stuff. And so and he's actually going to tell Timothy to drink wine because of his stomach problems. And so people use that all the time and say, oh, if we got upset, someone can drink wine. No, just take a Tums. We have Tums. Now, they didn't have Tums in the first century, But we'll talk about all that next week. So that's the widow section. And then next week, we'll talk about the elder section. And we'll look at that. Any questions about the first 16 verses? Any questions? All right, well, I appreciate y'all being here. I'm going to sign off with our